And we are recording. All right, what's up, everybody? Based on the title of the video, you kind of know what we're doing here. We're just gonna have a open conversation, as civilized as humanly possible, because without that, the conversation is utterly useless in the first place, in my opinion. So right here, I found on Reddit. I joined a few subreddits. I was able to find two Marxist-Leninists to have a conversation with me. So thank you guys for joining me. I appreciate it, as I said before we started. So yeah, if you want to introduce yourselves, I think that's a good place to start.
I'll jump in and go first.
Jeff. Yeah.
Alrighty. Hello, everybody. You can call me Comrade Chef. I'll be referred to as Chef throughout the video.
You can call me Julia. My pronouns are they, them.
Awesome. All right, everyone knows who I am. They don't want to hear me introduce myself. I'll tell you that. I think another just to kind of segue. What's if you guys want to give kind of like a brief summary of what kind of got you into the ideologies and the philosophy outlooks that you kind of have when it pertains to these subjects. Kind of what shaped your perspective and your drive to follow them. I think that would be a good understanding for everyone to kind of base their perspective on.
Julia, shall I lead again?
Sorry, what was that?
Would you like that I lead again, or do you want to take this one?
Absolutely. I would love if you talk first.
Well, to start, frankly, I started out as, well, something of a Nazi, in all honesty. I gained more education. I went to college. I realized that was just fucking insane. It was just lunacy. There's zero basis in reality for that ideology. And I mean, literally, like, a large part of that ideology was you can conjure things out of thin air just by sheer power of your will. Like, specifically the Germans in World War II, where we can overcome any obstacle through the willpower of the German soldier. I kind of bought into that shit. Came to realize it was shit. I went through a phase where I was a pretty disgusting shit lib. Like, just like profile pictures, just like with all the like whatever filter was like hot at the time, where it's like the pride flag, the like Ukrainian flag now would be the biggest thing. Kind of went through the same thing. I realized it was all shit. It didn't have any of the actual concrete answers for the real problems that existed in the world. And I started studying history, because history repeats. And when you start studying history, they have a saying. You study it long enough, you're forced to become either a Marxist or a liar. And I've found that to be true. Their understanding of history, their understanding of the forces at play and the interactions between different nations, different groups of people, is quite objectively correct once you come to understand what specifically they're saying.
All right, there's a lot to unpack there. We can unpack both perspectives after we kind of both introduce yourselves, if that works, just so we can kind of get everything out initially. Huey,
that works just fine for me.
Absolutely. I am proud to say that I was never a Nazi. For me, it was like, I'm a queer person. And I live in, like a deep red state kind of thing. And so I really saw a lot of, what you would expect to see, the both social oppression aspect and the economic pressures that are very common for queer people to have. And so it took me a long time to reconcile with this, and I also went through a very, liberal kind of in-poll phase, trying to figure things out through solely the lens of intersectionality. But like Comrade Chef said, that's only one piece of the pie. There's a lot deeper meaning to that, and for a little while I was an anarchist, and that was a little bit broader of a view, and then eventually, I read Marx, and then I read Lenin, and, so on and so forth. And what really got me was specifically the transitionary aspects of dialectical materialism and historical materialism, more so than the way anarchists look at history, more so than the way bourgeois historians look at history. Marxists focus a lot on how history changes, when quantitative changes change to qualitative changes, and that clicked a lot of buttons in my head, seeing how societies previously have rid themselves of oppression, have rid themselves of, the worst, ugliest aspects of humanity. And I was like, oh, that's how this works. And I'm sure we'll get more into all of this later, but I guess that's a brief summary.
All right, so just to touch on real quick, so you mentioned that you're in a kind of a deeper red state. Did that kind of shape in any aspect your kind of outlook and your beliefs nowadays, kind of being surrounded by people that you kind of just fundamentally disagreed with in the first place, or might it give you incentive to even be further driven away from said people or said side?
I've experienced a lot of hate in my life directed at me. I deal with consequences of that mental health wise. I have very bad social anxiety and whatnot. But it hasn't necessarily influenced my politics and how I look at people. For a little while, I was very isolated, which I think was my anarchist phase. But, a fundamental part of Marxism is wanting all working people to be united and democratically working together for, a better future.
All right, cool. And Chef, I gotta touch upon this. You claimed there used to be a Nazi. That's a heavy term. By Nazi, do you mean the stereotypical white supremacist, nationalist?
I mean, actual white supremacists believed in white supremacy, full on Nazi. It's not something I'm proud of, but owing to my background, I mean, frankly, I didn't know any better. There was no way I could have seen through that ideology that's built up when you're kind of born into it.
So you didn't just kind of stumble upon it one day, looking into history and whatnot. You were kind of surrounded by it as an upbringing in a sense, and kind of adopted.
Yeah, very much so. And frankly, you'll find that that's extremely, extremely common.
Yeah, I mean that goes to the notion that that racism and whatnot, and any hatred isn't really, you're not born with it. You're kind of taught and introduced it along the road of life. That's what I feel, at least, because children aren't inherently racist in any way. So I can understand that in a sense.
We have a slightly different position. To touch on it later, again, as we get further into the podcast. Well, I agree that nobody is inherently born racist, but it's not so much just what you're taught, but the specific conditions you experience in life. Like, there's always going to be antagonisms that you experience in your life, whether it's between, you and an individual person, you and an institution. Like, say you're in jail, there's an antagonistic relationship between you and the staff. It's just kind of how it works. Because you have differing interests. You want to go free, they want to keep you there. It's just inherently a difference of interests, and that causes antagonisms. And where the individual racism is born out is a difference of interests along racial lines, which is not inherent, but is itself a result of the conditions those different peoples live in, without an understanding of those causes. If you don't understand the causes, if you don't understand the fact that each and every one of us is living in their own material conditions that dictate their personal interests, the only conclusion you're ever going to reach is like, oh, well, fuck those guys. They want something I don't.
I think to clarify a little bit of what Comrade Chef said, Marxists don't believe that the different interests of people, such as like white supremacists, is a biological thing. So like the interests of a white supremacist is not based on them being a white person in some genealogical pseudoscientific way. It's purely a social relations, and specifically a relations to production matter.
I think for some examples, I think when we talk about, fascism in Germany in particular, the regime there was pretty straightforward with their cutthroat with their ideology. There was pretty much, if you're not, an Aryan looking person, you're against us. I don't know if it was necessarily a economic or anything. I think it was strictly driven by the incentive of you are different than me in inherently any way, and therefore you have to be executed. I mean, we can break it down and say, listen, Hitler was against Jews because of certain reasons or whatever. He was against blacks. It boils down to the fact that he was just inherently different. From my understanding, again, it could be perspective-wise and just be subjective what I'm thinking, but from everything I've ever heard, it's mainly, the biggest thing is just, the differences. It doesn't seem like it's economical. It doesn't seem like it just seems like they just were just against the people due to the pigmentation of the imperfections in their mind of what these people held. I could be wrong. That's how I've always kind of perceived it and heard about it, though, myself.
Well, we consider... Go ahead, Julia.
Absolutely, yeah. There's additional layers of context. I mean, for one, Marxists don't spend a lot of time talking about just an individual person's beliefs. Like, in my opinion, it is somewhat useless for me to just say that I'm a Marxist-Leninist, because politics is more than just what one person, vaguely believes in or whatever. So racism itself, for instance, has not always been a thing. Racism as an institution, as in categorizing people under pseudoscientific labels based on skin tone or other minor features, only started existing as a way to justify colonialism. And Marxists would say that this is a superstructural element of a certain economic base. Basically, rich European countries were relying on slave labor and exploiting the hell out of poorer countries in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. And to justify doing this, they made up this pseudoscience that they called race. So when Lenin talks about fascism, and Lenin was really the first communist to talk about fascism in its kind of earliest stage, he described it as capitalism in decay. And what he means by this is that capitalism, as Marxists understand it, is based on the contradiction between two classes: the bourgeoisie, who are the capitalists, the owners of factories and jobs and the bosses, and then there's the proletarians, who are the workers, the employees, the people who sell their labor time for a certain, wage.
If I may cut in real quick.
Absolutely.
Just to clarify for everybody, when Marxists talk about class, they're not talking about just the level of monetary wealth or things that you have. It's not a spectrum where you're like, oh, you get your lower class, your lower middle class, your upper middle class. That's not what we mean. The amount of money you have is entirely irrelevant to your class as far as Marxists consider it, because we're talking about the specific relationship you have with production and the labor market, because your personal interest in the labor market necessarily changes based on whether or not you are putting more into it by selling your labor, or you are taking more out of it by purchasing labor. If you purchase it, you want the cost of labor to be as low as possible. If you're selling it, you want the cost of labor to be as high as possible. This is just an irreconcilable difference of interests that arises naturally based on how you specifically interact with it. And this is the basis of what Marxists are talking about when they say class. The bourgeois, which are typically considered to be like the big business owners, really it starts with when you start to purchase more labor out of the labor market than you supply into it, because that is where the difference of interest begins.
Absolutely. That's 100% correct. I guess to quickly finish up my thought, when Lenin says that fascism is capitalism in decay, what he means is that due to various conditions that we could go deep into it, but I think this might be a little bit too specific and a rabbit hole for a 1 to 2 hour podcast. Germany, Spain, Italy, Japan, these places that became fascist in, before and during World War II, the contradictions between their classes was growing every day. And the workers, like there were communist movements and uprisings in Germany, in Italy, in Spain, for instance. And there was a Marxist movement even in Japan. And the capitalists were basically losing control of their workers. They were going to lose their accumulation of wealth. So the way that they avoided this was by distracting the working class, by making them hate each other. So instead of, a Jewish and a Romani and a white worker in Germany all working together to form a union to, advocate for better, labor rights, whatever, higher wages, lower hours. Instead, they were all hating each other because only one of them is the true Aryan. And so now the white worker, is collaborating with the bourgeoisie.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there. I didn't want to cut you off mid-thought, so I let it unpack. I gotta go back to kind of the beginning part of that real quick, and then we can touch upon the other thing. You mentioned briefly that colonialism was kind of the start of kind of slavery and discrimination against. I have to object to that. If we want to go back, the earliest that we can think of at the moment on paper, even though there's probably some before that due to archaeological evidence, but Mesopotamia, there was slavery in Mesopotamia. That was... I
did not say slavery. I said racism.
Okay, my fault for misquoting you there. Okay. Yeah. So you don't see a distinction between slavery and racism? Because I kind of see them as not the same, but they intertwined very deeply. You don't enslave people. I guess you do. You can enslave anybody. I think, maybe my picture of slavery is painted just based along the colonial version. I think I was trying to draw a connection there that wasn't really necessarily there.
If I may interject, you have kind of the same blind spot that most people have to it, because we're really never introduced to these concepts. The general public, at the very least, broadly has almost zero understanding of what Sumer and Akkad, Mesopotamia, was. They're introduced to it in school very briefly, if at all, through some shitty History Channel documentary, but it never really goes down into the meat of things, of the actual relationships that defined these cultures and these civilizations as far as we can understand. But even throughout Rome, it's a mark that we have no real literary, objective, factual evidence to support the claim that they divided people into different races and valued them as better or higher. We know that they considered themselves as different peoples, such as the Sumerians and the Akkadians. They considered themselves as different people, but there's no actual evidence to say that they considered themselves as a different race. It would be like the difference between the French and the Germans. They represent different peoples. They come from distinct lineages and tribes of people owing to the geographical area that the country occupies and the people that lived in that area in antiquity, in prehistory. But they don't consider themselves a different race, or at least usually. Germany obviously went through that weird little bout of Aryan nationalism, but there's just no evidence to support it, and that is kind of where a lot of people start to make the mistake of conflating slavery with racism, because we kind of presuppose that they had the same connections, the same view of each other as we do today. We kind of just assume that the Romans divided themselves up. Oh, well, I'm African Roman. Oh, I'm Spanish Roman. Kind of as we do today, but there's just no evidence for that.
you could think of it as ethno-linguistic and religious divides rather than this pseudoscientific, racism and racialization. So, as a kind of brief aside, I guess, a lot of our current thoughts about and I don't mean as Marxist, I just mean as Americans, we are exposed to this, and I'm sure you've seen this a whole lot, Josh, with the ever-growing and extremely, righteous Black Lives Matter movement, and people re-examining the history of America with a very critical lens. We still have a lot of holdovers from the American, very racist chattel slavery. And a lot of the justifications of that were built on pseudoscience that pretended to be, Darwinian evolutionary science. So basically, in order to have these pseudoscientific racialization of people, we first had to have actual science and the scientific method, which is a very new thing. And, Marxists recognize ancient slavery. We divide history into basically 5 different categories. And the second one is what we call slavery, which is like Mesopotamia, Rome, the Greek city-states, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I think I spoke too soon. When I talked without actually thinking it through, because I contradicted myself when I connected slavery and just race kind of into one big thing. It's there, but it's not always been there. I can agree that it might be a newer kind of concept. And you both make very good points when you're saying they didn't people back then weren't dividing themselves among they were different, but they weren't race-based different. I wasn't there. I don't know for sure, but it seems like it's logical. I do understand without a doubt that modern day racism, for the modern day, I mean last 500 years to present, is mainly, if not always, race driven. I think we might disagree whether or not that's caused by I might be misquoting you, kind of the bourgeoisie type of capitalist thing, or if that's kind of what you guys are kind of drawing that to. I don't want to misquote you either. So if that's not true, let me know. See, I don't know if that's how it is, or if it's just the fact that there's powers that be it would still be intact regardless of if it was a capitalist society, any society in general. I think those powers that be would still be there, still pushing these thoughts into the masses, causing these hysterias and doing these things. The average person isn't starting a slave trade. The average person isn't King Leopold II. You know what I mean? The average person isn't doing these things to people. Just like the average person isn't sending nuclear weapons across a country to another country. It always seems to inherently be the powers that be in the structure of societies that cause these things to happen. It's never the ordinary people. The people adopt these ideas. I mean, the average people didn't start the fascist movement in Germany. The average people, I guess for Marxism, it kind of did because, the uprisings and whatnot. That's kind of just grassroots from my understanding. They kind of form together. But when I'm talking about some specific ideologies, it's never just ordinary people that does these things. It seems to be power structures, and even with Marxism and whatnot, from what I've seen, once the revolutions and the revolutionaries succeed in their conquest and their goal, it does seem to be the powers that be that cause untold amount of death in every single layout of any of these that's ever happened. I mean, we can break down the death tolls based on country that these uprisings have happened. It is ungodly amounts of people. Everyone hyper-fixates on the 6 million plus dead during concentration camps, which is a ridiculous amount of people. I mean, people can't actually grasp how many people that actually is that died in such a short amount of time. But we go over to Mao's China, it's upward to 45 million. I mean, it's so I think it's the powers that be, the governmental structures, the people pulling the strings that kind of have the dictation on these things. That's my problem with every single structure of philosophy when it comes to ruling or guiding or dictating a population. I don't think any of them are good enough ideas to do because they all have bad things that are going to cause untold amounts of death.
Well, there's a lot to unpack there. I guess so. Here's Julia, if this is acceptable to you as well. Here's how I think we should kind of break this one down. First off, if I am misquoting you here again, obviously interject. You kind of seem to fall into the Great Man Fallacy. I think we should address that, how society necessarily has to create the individuals who act on society itself. There's no real basis to say that it's Stalin, it's Hitler, it's Gandhi, because they themselves are necessarily products of society in much the same way as you or I are. What they are is people who met opportunity. They are no different than you or I on a very fundamental level. If, say, you were to change places with Hitler, Hitler would just be some random dude, and you would be the genocidal leader of Nazi Germany, owing specifically to the material conditions of that person's life. Second, to break that down, well, you're going to run into this a lot with Marxist-Leninists if you don't want to actually listen to what we have to say ourselves on the matter. Frankly, probably just turn around right now. It's not going to be a very inviting place for you if you are unwilling to listen to our perspective on it. But the deaths attributed to communism are laughably overblown. To put it in perspective, like the victims of communism fund, they're like, oh, well, like 10 million people died in Soviet Russia. Well, I mean, if you break that down, like they're including like deaths from fucking World War II. They're including like Nazi collaborators, like fucking Azov Battalion, like the Ukrainian Banderistas, Stepan Bandera, a fucking Nazi war criminal. They're including fighters like that got shot and executed for collaborating with the Germans. Hell, even if you break down the Holodomor, like the famine in 1933 that started in Ukraine, if you break that down, the Western narrative on it very quickly falls apart. To get specific here, Ukraine themselves claims only 1.5 million people died in the Holodomor, as opposed to the like 4, 5, 6, 7, whatever number they like to just trot out. And to include in that, they themselves have to include quote unquote lost births, which is calculated based on the difference in population growth projected against what actually occurred in other nations. That's where they arrive at their total figure, is based on projected population growth from the previous population before the famine occurred, and compared that to what actually happened in their country with the famine. And this is just factual, openly acknowledged information. People just don't dig into it. Second, if we break apart the idea that like Stalin caused the famine, well, one, it's the weather. Stalin can't control the fucking weather. The famines were a regular occurrence throughout Europe, India, hell, even North America. The United States had famines prior to about 1840, when we started to really get on board with industrial agriculture. It was just a phenomenon that happened owing to the ways that we produced our food. We were tied to the land and to the weather that provided for us. Second, they make the claim that, oh, it was like bad farming practices. Stalin wanted to collectivize everything. And if you break that down, yeah, he was collectivizing everything. But that's not where the failures occurred. It was not like, oh, I don't want to do my work. Well, I mean, obviously, if you are told, hey, go do this thing, it's going to be kind of odious, even if you already like farm. But owing to the specific organization of the system, which again was brand new at the time, and was not just a product of Stalin, but of the whole Communist Party of the Soviet Union, which voted to enact this farming reform. Grain was frequently double counted by the farmers themselves when they were reporting how much grain they yielded from their fields, because their quota, that they had to supply to the state to build up like the grain reserves was based on their total output. If you
Oh, what the fuck? Okay, and we're going. Okay, sorry about that, guys. Issue with the Zoom. Go. Carry on, Chef.
So if we break down the narrative that like Stalin caused this famine, like a new farming system was implemented, not specifically by Stalin himself, but by general democratic decision of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. It was a collective decision arrived at by the totality of the party who were elected to represent the people. But what we find specifically is that in the transition to collective farm, the amount of grain that the farmers had to provide was based on their yearly averages. If they report a lot of grain being made, well, I mean, they're just going to have to keep producing that amount for their quota. They're not going to really get punished for it, but they're just not going to get the same reward. So what we find that they did, they underreported the amount of grain that was produced. And then when they had to go send it off to the state so that they could build up their grain reserves, they could send it to other areas that didn't have that great of a crop yield in that given year so that they could feed the people. They sent less than they actually were supposed to. As long as you were kind of like eyeballing it, like nobody, if they look into it real hard, is just going to be like, okay, yeah, that looks about right. And so we have these massive paper grain reserves that built up in the Soviet Union because the farmers were all, yep, everything's good here. The party officials who were in charge of checking on it, nobody was really checking on them. Like, yep, everything good here. So you got green lights across the board. But all of this grain that was supposed to be in reserve in the state was getting sold off on the market because the farmers were getting paid for it from the state. And at the same time, they could sell that same grain for sale on the market and get paid twice.
So it was. Sorry, go ahead.
I guess to generalize what Comrade Chef is saying, one of the biggest things that he mentioned is deficit of births. Almost all of these death counts for communism come from a single source, and that is the Black Book of Communism. It was published in the 90s, I believe. But of the researchers that made it, almost all of themselves distanced themselves from it because the lead researcher was supposedly obsessed with reaching the number 100 million deaths from communism. So one of the major ways it did this, like Comrade Chef mentioned, was deficit of births. And you see this again and again and again. When the birth rate goes down, they count the deficit in births per year as deaths under communism, even though no one was even born during that time.
Yeah, you can't kill somebody that was never born.
What do you mean they weren't born during that time? What does that mean? There was no one born during a whole era?
No. He's saying
there was a lower birth rate, is what I'm saying.
Oh, okay, my bad.
Due to like access to contraception, which was free and highly available in socialism all over the world, that kind of thing. But more specifically, I guess when you look at these deaths, they oftentimes relate to, like Comrade Chef said, Holodomor or famines, either in the Soviet Union or in China. We don't count deaths from the Dust Bowl or the Great Depression in America as being deaths from capitalism, even though, it was a result of overproduction of commodities on capitalism's fault in the 1920s that led to these, things. It would be unfair to say that the Dust Bowl was just a result of, these people. But I think overall, the most important thing that you were talking about earlier, Josh, was this like individual blame. Marxists don't necessarily take it on themselves to say, oh, this is all these capitalists' fault. No, we agree with you that it's about systems. It's about way people interact within a certain way the economy works. So, for instance, under feudalism, it's not King Philip specifically's fault that there was, these peasants that died of starvation this year. this is the result of the specific relations that peasants and serfs have to the commodities they're producing, their food under a feudal system, and the nobles and lords who are in the other end of the class spectrum, and how they both interact with the way, work is done.
All right, there's a lot to unpack there. First, I just want to start by getting to the Stalin and the Soviet Unions in particular kind of famine. Listen, I understand. You made a good comparison with the Dust Bowl and the Great Depression. I see the similarity there, and I think that's I agree that those death numbers aren't directly attributed to kind of capitalism. It's kind of attributed to over production and whatnot and shit like that. Economic crashes. My problem with the distinction there is what happened in the Soviet Union, what happened in Mao's China, is that the regimes in these countries very knowingly assigned farmers and agriculturists to start implementing jobs in manufacturing, to start being industrialized. They directly knew what was going to be the outcome, because if you get a farmer to start building metal beams, who's going to farm and who's going to make proper metal it's not a good system from my understanding. And not only is it not a good system, it's a deadly one. 10 million at least in the Soviet Union, and 45 million in China. Listen, we don't have to. I won't hyperfixate on the Soviet Union, because it's not more understandable, but it's not as significant in the sense because not that 10 million people isn't as significant. I'm saying 45. The reason that's more significant for me is because it was part of the Great Leap Forward agenda, where it was a whole sweeping blanket term of killing anybody who went against you in any sort of way ever. Killing anybody, and then at the same time limiting all the food supply in a country where 45 million people died, not just because of the Great Leap Forward, but directly due to the lack of food production. Mao and his regime knew about this. They were known every step of the way that these debts were going to keep piling up and skyrocketing, and they kept doing it. They just did not stop. They kept doing it. We can look at Cambodia. It's not a famine, but they killed 2 million out of 7 million people died under a communist regime. I mean, I'm not, and again, I'm really not trying to be, I might be coming off as, and if I am, I apologize. I'm not trying to come off as apprehensive or in denial that capitalism is the goal, because capitalism sucks in a lot of ways. Monopolization is a huge one for me. But what I'm saying is, I think death in capitalism is a semi-byproduct. I don't think it's a direct correlation and causation. When I look at communism in particular and all the branches that kind of go around and fit its model, I look at it as a direct correlation to deaths, because every single time it's implemented, ungodly amounts of people have died.
Well, I mean,
I would love to. I would love to.
You want to take the lead?
Absolutely. I would love to first off agree with you about Cambodia. Marxist-Leninists do not uphold Pol Pot's horrible lunacy. That was a huge, awful thing that happened there that was anti-socialist and was just, it was the aesthetics of revolution to justify a very, very sick man ethnically cleansing his country. And it is one of China's worst mistakes, I think, to support Pol Pot. Especially when Cambodia was fighting against Vietnam.
And to clarify, it needs to be stated that none of us hold the position that, the USSR or China did everything right, that everything went perfectly. No, nobody holds that position.
Mao himself self-critiqued regarding both the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution. He said, hey, these had good ideas in them, but with the Great Leap Forward, he called it an excess, basically. And the Cultural Revolution was, again, just not well organized. And so, for instance, a lot of the deaths, imprisonments, all this kind of stuff during the Cultural Revolution was because the Communist Party was entrusting a lot to the Red Guard, who were a lot of times just college students, who were just very zealous and very eager and didn't have enough proper discipline and training. So there were absolutely mistakes, excesses, horrible things that happened that needed to be stopped and were stopped, and they shouldn't be, forgotten. They need to be critiqued, and they need to be, I would disagree it's as bad as Western education makes it out to be, because a lot of it was not You know, for instance, Comrade earlier mentioned about like, oh, this isn't like, you know, Stalin himself, you know, eating all of the grain in Ukraine. This is a system that's working inefficiently right now. So there's a really great book by a Professor Goverfor called Khrushchev Lied, and it basically breaks down a lot of the myths that you hear about Stalin, which can be then kind of applied to other communist leaders. And that's that they were these authoritarian, evil dictators, when in fact Stalin and Mao didn't have all the power. You know, they were democratically elected, and they had other people who were also working with them.
If I may put it out there, Stalin himself tried to resign like 12 times and was directly ordered by the Supreme Presidium of the Soviet Union to resume his post.
Yeah, they were functioning democratic countries, not a single authoritarian tyrannical dictatorship, which can't work anywhere really.
I mean, people, you know, a lot of the population also supported Hitler during what he was doing for a long time for fascism. I don't think that's a good comparison to kind of say that a brainwashed population who's living in Stockholm syndrome is kind of going to re-elect someone who's kind of doing crazy stuff into the thing. I mean, look at FDR in the U.S. I mean, horrible man. And he was elected, what, 3 or 4 terms? Stockholm syndrome. I mean, you can switch out.
If I may,
yeah, go ahead.
I think your comparison of Stockholm syndrome there. One, when you mention FDR himself, that shows directly that one, this is not just communism.
I agree.
This is a phenomenon
that
occurs universally. People latch on to a given leader based on what they feel is being done by that leader. But this is specifically because they do not understand that, one, it is not the leader themselves as an individual that is enacting these change. FDR himself as an individual was no more instrumental to the changes in the United States than someone that, one, held the same beliefs as him, and two, had the same means to enact those changes. Anybody who believed the same things as FDR and put in the same position is functionally identical to FDR. Who he was as an individual is entirely irrelevant. And the same holds true for Mao, for Stalin, for Lenin. Who they were as individuals is entirely irrelevant to what happened, because what happened is a result of, one, what they believed, and two, opportunities that they were able to take to bring their movement that they had built to the forefront of historical events. But even that, them and the movement they built, functionally identical if you replace them as individuals with people, you know, that have the same beliefs, that even not necessarily the same beliefs, but have the same framework of belief, that have the same worldview for how they fit things into their personal understanding of it. If you believe, for example, dialectical materialism, that all things are materially connected, that A necessarily leads to B because of the causal chain of events, then you are going to end up at C as the next step every time, because it's a linked chain of events.
Yeah, but using your own terminology to my reverse into my perspective, that's how I see communism in a sense. And again, just for reference, I say communism as an easy out to group all these together. And if that's like if I'm being like a dickhead by that, I apologize. There's so many subcategories. I just use it as a blanket term, and I know if it's not factually accurate. So for that, I apologize. If you want me to specifically state which branch of Marxism ideology I'm kind of referring to, just let me know any along the way. But when I think of these types of ideologies and philosophies, that's how I see it. A equals B. A is going to lead to B, and B is going to lead to C. A revolution is going to lead to a new regime. A new regime is going to lead to oppression of the people. Oppression of the people is going to cause the people, some of them to hate it, some of them to love it because they're too scared, which in return is going to lead to an ungodly amount of death. That is what it looks like to me.
I would say
I agree with the first 3 steps.
Say that again, sorry.
I agree with the first three steps of what you said. And that's because of, and I think to a certain extent, these specific examples aren't necessarily the most useful way we could be talking about this to get a really good grip on Marxism. Because ultimately the way Marxists see the world isn't these specific historical events. It is a chain reaction. History is ever in motion because history is an aspect of nature. Human society is a studyable phenomenon that we can, see how it works and see how it evolves. So, for instance, the Marxists would say that the reason why history changes is based on the mode of production. And what we mean by this is how people are creating the things that society needs to function: food, housing, clothing, whatever. And as that changes, the class relations and the way the system is built changes as well. So when, feudalism had a time limit, feudalism could only last so long because the contradictions between the peasants and the lords were too great for one, but also because, eventually we were having steam power. Eventually we were colonizing the world for their, Western Europe was for their, resources, heavy metals, coal, whatever. And so these new modes of production that change the way people interact with labor, rather than you own your own tools at your own farm and then every year the knights come along and take 50% of it. Instead, now you work in a factory. And that factory requires you to have a different relationship to your production than you did under feudalism, because you no longer own your tools. You no longer own the commodities you produce, et cetera, et cetera. So society has changed. The way that this was put forward, the way this is worded by Stalin in his book, Dialectical and Historical Materialism, it's a really short read. I would recommend it as a quick kind of introduction to Marxist analysis of history. He says that because history does not change because of these minutiae, history doesn't change because of population growth or geographic, location of where you are. These things are influencers. But what changed the system of slavery, the system of feudalism, was that you couldn't just own someone anymore because there were too many slave revolts. Rome fell when a whole bunch of, the quote unquote barbarians, people they had previously oppressed, came back to fight him and destroyed him. The contradiction resolved itself because it was too strong, and then the way that it worked changed. Now everybody owns their own land and farms their own stuff, and it gets taken away from them by their lord. So rather than history being these individuals, that these great men, quote unquote, that you hear a lot in bourgeois academics, your Churchills, your whoever, big leaders, it's instead the way a class of people who all interact with the way society produces things. It's all about how their role in society changes. And
if
we
I
see
may
this
quickly
first
interject there.
Absolutely.
I think it's worth noting that because we are collectively connected in production and economy, like we're not just an isolated individual, we necessarily take on statistical properties. We necessarily take on collective properties just out of the interactions we have with each other. This is unavoidable.
Yeah, there are two features of production according to Marxists, and one of them is the productive forces, and the other half of it that is really important to understand is the relations of production, the way workers interact with what they're making, whether they own what they made or not, how who's paying them to make what they own, who's getting the profit from what they built, et cetera, et cetera.
I think what I'm kind of trying to figure out here in my head is where's the evidence of private ownership in any of these regimes throughout history when it comes to Marxist ideologies. I mean, by nature, correct me if I'm wrong, isn't the whole notion is, the things will be owned by the people, all the production, all the land, everything will be owned by the people. It doesn't seem to be like that to me at least, because you look at these patterns throughout it. It seems like it might start that way, like everything starts like what is promised. Every U.S. president starts doing what they say they're going to do when they're campaigning, but then they just stop. then they stop doing it. Because once they get that power, they realize they don't have to do it because they're already in power. So once that stuff happens, they say, oh, you know what, you don't need all this. We're going to take hold of this. Stalin promised bread, land, and peace, and what did he give him? He gave him military interjection. I mean, it's just, it doesn't seem to me like, it seems like it's a very good fundamental idea to distribute everything equally, which I think I really do think is a great idea, because not one single person is inherently better than another person. We're all born on the same rock, spinning around godly amounts of speed, doing, everything's crazy enough as it is. The fact that we want to subdivide ourselves amongst, classes or categories, whatever term you want to use, it's lunacy to me. It's insane. That's where I agree with both of you in that sense. It's crazy. But the problem is, there's never been a clear-cut example of not using these structures where it actually works out, from what I've seen at least.
If I may.
Yes.
One, you keep coming back to, like for example, just the 45 million in China, the XYZ amount. We've already started to show you that, one, this might not necessarily be based in fact, which I think kind of places the onus on you to reevaluate your consideration of what that actually looks like. If your information just doesn't really hold up to examination,
in that case it does. It absolutely does. Minimum 45 million people died under Mao. Minimum.
Well, again, I think it's worth noting that the country underwent a 20-year civil war where not only were they engaged in constant warfare, but it was Chinese killing Chinese. For example, the U.S. Civil War in 4 years killed 100,000 people. The U.S. had a significantly lower amount, 600,000, had a significantly lower population than China. It went on for about a quarter of the length. Of course, there's going to be huge amounts of death out of civil war between a country with 500 million people in its population. It's generalized warfare of the people. It's gonna have its impact. It's going to reduce the ability to produce food. A civil war is going to result in starvation. It's going to result in these things. And this is a necessary feature out of any revolution. It doesn't matter if it's a communist revolution. It doesn't matter if it happens here in the United States. What happens to all of the excess population we built up with our modern production methods for food, with our transportation infrastructure, that if there's a civil war, it all falls apart. If people are dropping J-dams on the fucking railroad tracks, in the distribution facilities, all of that comes to a halt, and you're going to have, well, probably hundreds of millions of deaths.
You're also going to have hundreds of millions of deaths if we did the same exact thing that Mao did in 58 when we did the Great Leap Forward. If we did it in the U.S. and we redistributed all actual resources and skilled artisans who knew about farming and agriculture and crops and all that, and made them do jobs they had no understanding about because they wanted the industrial revolution in their own country at that time. That would also result in 100 million plus deaths in the U.S. if it happened today, because it's ridiculous to do. In any, whether it's capitalism, whether it's any structure you want to do, when you're going to reallocate a vast majority of your artisan workers who know what they're doing and they're supplying food for your country, and make them do something they have no idea of how to do, with no actual thought going into it of how you're going to produce food. That is ridiculous. I don't care if it's Marxist, capitalist, anarchist. I don't care what it is. It's crazy. It's insane.
I guess just for the sake of argument, to assume that that number there is correct, I don't necessarily disagree with the conclusion that you draw. I think it's misrepresented, one, how drastic that was, but I don't necessarily disagree with the specific conclusion that you've reached, that, hey, this was probably a bad idea. Hell, Mao himself, in hindsight, was like, yeah, that was a really bad idea. I fucked up. I should have realized the consequences. And in light of the historical fact of the thing, I can see how this was always going to lead to this consequence. And hindsight is 20/20. I mean, you can say that for everybody. What we're trying to do, and there's always going to be a learning curve with this, especially if you do not properly understand how things are connected and interrelated, is to come up with a more efficient method of resource allocation than the capitalist markets. And I think on the whole, the very fact that China, within the time frame of, 50 years, dragged itself from like literal feudalism up to like modern industrialism.
Bro.
One, it worked. It objectively did what they set out to do. It had unintended consequences that, again, the people who did this were like, yeah, no, we fucked up in doing this. So we don't necessarily agree like, hey, yeah, let's just take the great leap forward and apply it everywhere. That's not how it works. The specific solutions for one country are not the solutions for every country.
I think we're going to disagree heavily on this one because the current state of China and the CCP party is probably one of the most tyrannical things I see on the face of the earth right now. They have over 1 million Uyghur Muslims in re-education concentration-like camps. I have seen videos of surveillance of these people in rows upon rows, blindfolded, tied, butt-ass naked, just sitting in courtyards. These are innocent people.
I think you should examine the U.S. prison system. We do effectively the same thing.
I'm not trying to compare it to the U.S. I understand the U.S. is awful in many ways.
Well, here's the thing. You're saying it's one of the most tyrannical dictators.
Not the. Bro, you're preaching to the choir with the U.S.'s flaws. You're preaching to the choir. I get called out every day by everybody around me for talking shit about American structure because it's very bad in a lot of ways. The prison system's a horrible one. We have a fake sense of democracy in this country. We have a ridiculous puppet show cycling every 4 years to elect a popularity contest of who can kill the most innocent civilians across seas. You're preaching to the choir. I'm not a fan of what we have going on here either. Just to be very clear. Very, very clear. I'm very against a lot of things that happen here. But we're also not having mass surveillance of every single citizen, Patriot Act aside. Two different scales. We do. They have cameras everywhere of everything, facial recognition. They have a social credit system where if you're not a good citizen, you're restricted from buying things, from traveling, from internet speed, from public transportation.
That one's objectively untrue. You'll find that
No, it's not.
You'll find even Western sources fully admit that the social credit system is oriented at businesses and business owners, not individuals.
That is just not true. That is just not true.
Bloomberg has reported on it.
To go backwards a little bit.
Quick, I don't hold Bloomberg as any high status thing, just to be honest with you. And I wouldn't assume you would either because it's a very, very privatized monopoly type of media outlet. It kind of contradicts the whole. I don't know. I don't buy into any nonsensical mainstream outlet that says these things that are pushed by bureaucratic monopolizations of corporations in this country that have deep-rooted ties to the CCP party and their interests in mind, in every notion available.
I would disagree that they have their interests aligned with the CCP. I mean, the very fact that they support U.S. capitalism, when U.S. capitalism is itself directly opposed to Chinese communism.
What would U.S. capitalism...
Militarily, socially, everything.
What would U.S. capitalism be without the CCP right now, without the means of ungodly amounts of production that we export to China? What would the U.S. be right now without China? If we put tariffs... ridiculous tariffs like we do with Russia, for instance, on China, what would happen to America? It would absolutely crumble. Why does the Hollywood and media companies absolutely love kissing ass of the CCP party? Why did sports organizations, the NBA, why did they refuse to allow any of their players or anybody in their association to say one negative critical thing against the CCP party? Because this country
obviously there are going to be economic consequences.
Yes, because
and that's And that's a source of deep, deep concern. Look at all of the anti-China propaganda that's going on in the United States right now. You see, and I think it's notable, you see from the same capitalists themselves about every 4 years, China's on the verge of collapse. What does this mean for us? China's on the verge of collapse. How are we going to economically benefit from this? But it never happens. They know that they are economically dependent on China. But so long as they can use that as a means to maintain control over the population here, as long as they can use that as a means to make money, which is the big thing capitalists are concerned about, they don't give a fuck. They don't give a fuck about themselves personally having control over the physical means of production. As long as they make money out of it, they don't care, because capitalism is a system oriented exclusively and specifically to maximize return on profit. And as long as that requirement is satisfied, they don't give a fuck how it's carried out.
I think the distinction is you're not talking all capitalists. I don't think you can't blanket term all of them, because I know small business owners, for instance, who deeply care about their business, their customer base, their employees. I think, and I could be speaking for you, so please correct me if I'm misquoting, because I that's not what I want to do in any sense for either of you. I think what I'm understanding is it's the monopolization and the large lobbying and the bureaucratic aspect of things that get their claws deep into all sectors. Is that, or is it against everything? Is it against the mom and pop businesses as well?
The former for sure. And the big two classes in Marxism that we talk about under capitalism are just because these are the two that one owns most of the, ability to produce things in private property, and the other one that does most of the work, and that's the capitalists and the workers. But there are other classes. So for instance, there's the lumpen proletariat, which is kind of almost workers. Your chronically unemployed people, homeless folks, sex workers, people who live kind of in the shadows of society, who aren't given any support. Another class is what we call the petty bourgeoisie, the small capitals, like you said, small business owners. And capitalism, like these exist there, but capitalism, like you said, monopolizes. It naturally crushes the small business owners and turns them. These people used to be artisans, and they used to be, small-time merchants in feudalism and early capitalism, mercantile industrial capitalism. Well, now under imperial capitalism, most of them are now workers. They are now proletarian. So that is a thing to lament. But I guess to kind of bring it back, because I think it's good to stay as broad as possible for this conversation, since it's not going to be, probably long enough for us to get into really deep minutia.
Yeah, one quick. I'm sorry to cut you off. Again, thank you for your time, by the way. If I had 4 or 5 hours, I swear to God, I would. If in the future we could definitely sit down for a really prolonged amount of time, if need be or whatever, just for future reference, because this is kind of Spark Notes version of everything, just for the audience and you guys. But carry on. I'm sorry for interrupting, but thank you. Anyways.
Oh, absolutely. I absolutely appreciate you having us on. To talk about the successes and failures of socialism, about industrialization. Socialism has gone well and wrong, sometimes at the same time, sometimes one or the other, because Marxists believe in applying basically the scientific method to developing society. And that doesn't mean that Marxists are willy-nilly let's just test this thing out right now and see if it works. It's a crap shot. No, they're going to theorize and debate and try to figure out the best course of action, and then they might make mistakes. And those mistakes can be very tragic and can be very, very bad. But sometimes they also have really good results. So while the early period, especially the first 5 years of the Soviet Union, was not good. There was a lot of death, largely, again, resulting in the Civil War. Something like a dozen countries invaded the Soviet Union after the 1917 revolution. That lasted for many years, and the Soviet Union even had to compensate for it by having the new economic policy, which was basically more state capitalism to help develop production outside of a socialist context. But the thing is that like Comrade Chef said, so the Soviet Union before the revolution was semi-feudal. It was still largely illiterate. Most people were serfs. There was still a czar. And in 30 years, there was 100% literacy, 0% homelessness. Rent was capped at 5% of an income. They were the biggest readers per capita, and then in 30 years they sent the first anything into space, and then the first human being into space. They developed rapidly because of the planned economy and because of applying the scientific method and testing things and seeing how to do this well.
All right, I got it. Curious. You said 100% literacy since post civil wars and the invasions, or just post introduction of the new philosophy as a whole?
I believe it was in the 1930s. Correct me if I'm wrong, Comrade Chef. When 100% literacy, when these really big achievements the Soviet Union became known for. I think it was in the early 30s that this came out.
I believe it was 1932 that they hit 88%, and then by 1937, I believe they hit 99%.
I didn't know that. I was just like, my brain was just like doing some gymnastics. Okay, I'm not.
Well, and I mean, I think if we examine,
or is that kind of what the Soviets would kind of like claim? Like, is this universally accepted that this is what happened outside of the country in itself?
I mean, it depends on if you want to propagandize it or not. But like, say, countries in Africa, Italy accepts it, Romania, Yugoslavia. It just depends on who specifically has an agenda against this specific claim. But broadly, yes, it's accepted as fact. And I think if we break it down, it makes sense. You're trying to, one, take a country away from like feudal agriculture to where they got to learn how to operate tractors. They got to learn how to do the math to calculate, you know, their yield and grain weight, do all of these much more technically complex tasks than is just like hoe in the field, and then tax band comes along and collects your grain, as was the previous system. So they necessarily have to educate the population to make their system work. I mean, this was stated directly in, basically every major communist work is that you need to educate the people, that the general education of the population has to increase in order to undertake more and more sophisticated, more advanced methods of production.
So a lot of the information, I guess, so you can research this later yourself, Josh, about the Soviet Union specifically. We obviously have their published numbers at the time, and those obviously have bias in them. But what's really useful is after the dissolution of the USSR, what were called the Soviet archives, which were basically internal government documents that were not released to the public. These were just for the use of the state, were uncovered, and they're now public information. Some of them haven't been translated yet, but a lot of it has been. So this lacks a lot of the bias because this wasn't for propaganda purposes. There was no, this was just what the state was talking in itself about how to keep the country running. And this is how we can confirm a lot of information since 1992 is the uncovering of the Soviet archives, quote unquote.
Yeah, I think it's important that we address this one point in particular because, obviously from my stance, I haven't really credited the opposition, in my view, the opposition in like a good light or anything positive. I think that's just my inherent bias that I'm faulted of. But I think it was important, with everything, there's always productive things that come out of any event, you know what I mean? And especially in the West, we like to kind of blind up anything that gives an enemy any limelight to their regime or to their actions or whatever, you know what I mean? So I think it's important to find any of the positives that came out of these. I don't want any of the deaths. I'm not gonna put a number to any of the deaths and any of the chaos that ensued. So I think that was important to address. I'm definitely gonna try to look into that. And if you guys could send me the link to those the archived the unarchived Soviet numbers, I'd love to look at those after the podcast if you happen to have them by chance.
Absolutely, I would love to send you resources.
Hell yeah, yeah. Anything you guys want to send me, I'd happily appreciate. I was gonna ask before this, but I kind of wanted to come in just having the conversation with my understanding, opposed to kind of having all your points kind of in my head. You know what I mean? Just kind of see where it went, opposed to the latter of the two. But yeah,
I think something you would agree with, and something that we kind of say for ourselves is you should let us defend ourselves. You shouldn't here's what Germany has to say about communism. Here's what the United States has to say about communism. If you want to understand communism, you should talk to the actual communists.
I mean,
sorry, go ahead.
No, you go ahead. I call you guys off like 8 times. Please go ahead, please.
Absolutely. A big thing to remember on a kind of large scale talking about socialism is that we have a very limited view of the world in the United States because we are arguably the richest country in the world. You know, we're in our own bubble, basically. But the majority of the population on the planet is in what we like to call third world countries, developing countries, whatever you want to call them. The vast majority of the world is being exploited on a global scale. So when, you know, and I'm not attacking you because it sounds like you have a very reasonable and well, you know, thought out critiques of capitalism and American capitalism in particular. But a big thing that I like to quote is I believe it was Fidel that said this. You know, people talk about the failures of communism, but where are the successes of capitalism in Latin America, Asia, and Africa? Basically, the vast majority of capitalist countries are hellish. You know, you can look at Haiti. You can look at, you know, the Philippines. You know, these places under extreme poverty. That is the vast majority of example of this system. And socialism, according to communists, is not the final step. Our goal is not, you know, Marxism-Leninism applied as a, you know, as a social society. That is, you know, step 2 in a 5-step program to reach a stateless, classless, moneyless society. So, like, you know, we recognize imperfection. We need to critique these things. It's absolutely imperative for Marxists to critique previous socialist experiments and not hero worship and not, you know, all these different things. But it's also important to remember that what we see right now is not the end goal of communists. There is always aiming for better along the way.
What is the end goal, like, initially? Like, is there different avenues that people kind of come up with when it comes to the end goal, or is there, like, kind of a understanding of one universal outcome that people kind of wish to see?
Everyone in the socialist camp broadly agrees that the end goal is a society that is, one, stateless, so there's no individual nations, there's no government, really, moneyless, so you don't have, like, paper currency or anything like that to do your exchange. There's just a general surplus of stuff that when you need something, you can just go to the baker and he just bakes bread because it's something he enjoys. He has passion for it. And as a chef, I completely understand that. There's plenty in my field that work almost exclusively for the passion. A lot of us are actually pretty dirt poor. And when you need bread, you just go to the baker like, hey, I need some bread. But because there's general surplus of stuff, you're not like, oh, I need to hoard the bread. I need like 50 loaves of bread, which would cause shortages. You because of the society that you were raised in, this post-scarcity society really is kind of the dream of it. You kind of just cooperate to help keep it going because it's beneficial for everybody.
See, I can just be honest. I can really get on board with the limited to zero government idea for sure. I mean, I can. You're preaching the choir on that one, especially on a federal level. You are preaching to the choir.
Oh yeah, well, I think so anarchists they imagine that getting rid of the government is as simple as just all right, let's just get rid of it. And this is where a lot of the critique of Marxism-Leninism comes in. We don't see it as that simple. There's necessary steps you have to take so that society does not recreate government. So that when you take when you take your hands off the steering wheel, somebody else doesn't jump right in and start steering the bus for you. And that's kind of the steps we had. That's where the worker state comes in. In order to build a society that does not have a state, first of all, you have to eliminate social classes. And I mean, by that, I mean economic social classes where different people have differing amounts of economic impact owing to differing relationships to production itself.
I get the rudimentary outlook on it. I do. I don't ascribe to it. Just to be honest with you, I understand. It's not like I'm coming from a place where I think it's wrong outward, because again, I think it's a good idea in a sense, because Like I made it the point earlier. There's no I see no distinction amongst me and other people in any way. The only distinction I see amongst me and other people is life experiences and how my mind has shaped the realization of said experiences. That's the only difference I actually see in people, is how you go about life. Besides that, everything about us is we're made of the same shit. We're gonna die. When we die, our body's gonna decompose the same way. Everything's gonna happen the same fucking way. So it's ridiculous that these class systems even exist in the first place. But when I do understand the class system in a sense, this is where I kind of contradict my own thinking, is if you have a skill that we as a society collectively agree upon that is more inherently valuable to society than a said other skill. So I'm gonna get people mad here. If you're a cab driver, and then you have another guy who can build a rocket ship, those are monumentally different importances. People still need to drive cabs. People still need to get from one place to another. But people also really, really need to get to the fucking moon, or, in the space. And you can't just teach anybody off the street to fly into space and build a rocket that's going to sustain life long enough. You could realistically teach any human being on Earth who is functional to drive a taxi cab.
Our answer to that, well, I guess it's kind of a multi-part answer. One, you need to understand social production. That, like, all production, like whether it's like that rocket ship, for example, you can't build that rocket ship without farmers. It's just kind of a fundamental truth. Everybody needs to eat. You can't build the rocket ship without the miners. You can't build the rocket ship without the people refining that raw ore into steel, into titanium, alloying it into these specific formulations for the rocket ship itself, which is itself a very technical and involved process in designing the materials, the material science behind it. It's all of these complex acts of labor that go into it. It's not just the lead engineer. The lead engineer himself is no more responsible for the rocket ship in terms of the actual work he himself performs than is the miner. Like, for example, put it like this. If the workers themselves say the team of engineers, rather, let me get more specific, has to do the same work as the lead engineer, and they divide it amongst themselves, total amount of work stays the same. Just because you assign a specific task to a specific person does not change the amount of work that has to be done. It doesn't change the value of the work being performed simply because you've assigned it to one specific individual and say, oh, well, he's leader. It doesn't change it. It's just this idea that we've built up around it, that because of the specific conditions in history, one person did take the leading role. That there are these Churchills, Lenins, these FDRs, these great men, quote unquote, in history, these people that had the opportunity to step up to leadership, that because they did, they deserved more. It's this idea we've built up because we don't really understand social production at a societal level.
I 100%. Oh, I'm so sorry. Go ahead.
No, please go. If Roots Reference, if I interview you, just keep talking. I'm going to stop because it's getting crazy now. I'm sorry. Go ahead. All
right, absolutely. I think Comrade Chef is 100% right. I think what matters most about, like, and what you're saying is right. Different roles require different skill sets and technical, know-how, et cetera, and those things, have to be treated somewhat differently from each other. The class didn't come out of, yesterday, though. Class is a very, very old thing. So Marxists place human organization at the very beginning under what's often called primitive communism, quote unquote, basically relatively egalitarian hunter-gatherer or early agrarian societies. And then as, the way we interact with our labor rapidly evolved, now you have some people that grow food and some people that make pots and some people that build houses. And the person that builds the houses realizes that everybody else is dependent on them to build their house. So they say, hey, you give me a cut of what you have, and I'll give you a smaller cut of what I produce. And then over time that evolves into some people being the slave owners and all of their slaves who they own as private property doing all of the work for them. And that evolves into feudalism and then into capitalism. So while there are differences in technical relations of production, these different things have a context behind them that stretches back 3,000 years of human history. And the idea of like these people do more work than someone else is basically a retroactive justification of the system that it was already in place.
And to add to that, I think it's very much worth considering how circumstantial any individual person's place within the system is. Like, you are you just because you happened to be born you. Like, if that makes any sense. Like, you could never have been anybody else. You didn't get to choose where you were born, when you were born, to whom you were born, the neighborhood you grew up in, what your parents were like. You had no say in any of that. In a very real sense, it was kind of just inflicted on you. You were inflicted with existence. And that's all circumstantial to you. You had no choice in it. There was no agency. To say that somebody, because of their circumstances, like, well, shit, you can't be an engineer. You're just some dude off the street. Fuck you. I think that's monstrously unfair. He had no say in it.
I think when we refer to capitalism, we use the word slave labor and the classism, and we kind of divide it amongst workers. I think the distinction comparing working class people to like slave labor is kind of just it's a far stretch for me. I get the comparison because, you know, there's hierarchy systems is a master, and there's I get the comparison that a lot of people make in that, but man, there's actual slavery right now. Like, there's modern
to clarify
slavery.
On that. We're not stating that it is like chattel slavery. Like, not at all. What we're saying through that is that it bears similarities in its characteristics, just as does, say, indentured servitude, which, if we're going to get real accurate, would probably be more accurately called contract slavery. We're not saying they're the same thing, but we're saying that they're related. It just arose out of a need to try to communicate the idea that there's this relationship between these two ideas, and it happened to be wage slavery. You can disagree, hey, maybe that's not an appropriate title for it. It doesn't particularly matter because it's not, one, it's already an established thing. There's so much theory built up using that terminology. It would be like trying to say, well, let's change the word house just because fuck it. It's a monumental task for ultimately no real difference in outcome. And two, we're talking about specific relationships that exist out of the systems that we interact in. And regardless of what we call them, those relationships actually exist.
Yeah, my
there is
go ahead.
There is many differences, you're right, between the slaves of ancient society and then the serfs and the peasants and then modern day workers.
I'm not even talking
and they all have,
I'm talking modern day slavery. There's more modern day slavery than there ever was in any other time period in the history of the earth. There's more slavery now than there ever has been. And that gets massively overlooked. Massively.
And a whole lot of it is happening right here, right now, especially with sex slavery in America. You're absolutely right. And these things have an economic function. These things play a role in the way society is shaping itself and is changing. You know, some of the most important communist leaders have been from sex work and these horrific institutions. You're absolutely right. I misunderstood you thinking that you were comparing, or that you thought I was comparing ancient slavery and serfdom. Yeah, no, absolutely. They are different roles.
That's my fault for not clearing my view. That's my fault on that. I didn't make that. I just brought in the term slave. I didn't actually pinpoint the time period. That's totally my fault on that one. My thing is, listen, if I have to work tomorrow, I got to work Monday. If I just decided, oh man, I don't feel good or I don't want to work, I can call in the night before. I can call in the day of even. My boss is going to be pissed, but he'll understand. If I wanted to just completely quit the job and start a whole nother occupation, if I wanted to quit the job and become a chef, if I want to I could quit my job right now and become anything I possibly wanted to. Literally, I could. It's possible. Is it easy for some things? Absolutely not. It would probably take a long amount of time, hard work, effort, a lot of sleepless nights. It's achievable. Absolutely. The problem is, when you compare, when we blanket the term of worker and classify it in the same category as the word slave, I know what you're not directly saying it is. I'm just saying it needs another word, because if you're a slave, if you want to call in tomorrow, you're going to get fucking killed. They're going to put a bullet through your head, or they're going to sell you to somebody else, or they're going to torture you, or they're going to send you and your family into sex trafficking, or they're going to work you until you can't stand up. There is a big distinction.
If you want to say we need a different word for that, I'm not going to say that the term that was used 200 years ago is necessarily the best term we could put on it. I don't really care. I've learned to understand what that term specifically is talking about. I don't see it as like, oh, well, he's comparing it to chattel slavery. It's just not how I personally see the term anymore, just because of my familiarity with it. So if you want to say, hey, you should come up with a different term, okay, fine. But I guess our point here is that the idea we're talking about doesn't change because of the label we use for it.
Fair enough. Yeah, I was kind of hyper fixated on that. I needed to get the point out there because it was kind of eating away at me for a minute. Because I'm not saying you guys, but there are a lot of people who will say that and actually classify workers as slavery, like in a literal sense. You know what I mean? Like I've heard other people have conversations like this, and they'll literally refer to it as a physical comparison, as if they're interchangeable. And it drives me nuts. Well,
this is why we say you need to study theory. If you don't study theory, you're going to come out with some really stupid ass takes because you don't understand the specific relationships. You don't understand the mechanistic basis behind all of these interactions that go into making up society. If you don't study it, you don't understand it.
I feel like the CCP doesn't understand their own philosophies in that sense then, because they have a shit ton of large corporations that aren't even privately owned. They're owned, but the government has full power of them. But there's still subclasses inside of communist China as we speak. There's still factories where people make pennies on the dollar for making the newest iPhone every single 6 months.
To go back to modern China specifically, I guess they don't claim that they've reached socialism. They claim that they're building socialism according to their own government plan. I'm sorry, repeat that?
Primary stage socialism, or socialism with Chinese characteristics, yeah.
They're not even projected by their own plans to reach the initial stages of socialism until about 2070. Again, by their own fucking plans. The only thing they claim is that they are using Marxism-Leninism to build towards socialism. You can disagree, and many of us do disagree. The specifics that they are doing, I mean, for example, China has abandoned the method of planned production, and I personally have my reservations about that because I see some shortcomings, especially as we are entering an era of global scarcity of resources where you can't just go producing shit willy-nilly and say, the market will figure it out. But at the same time, you know what? China understands China better than I do. I'm not going to at all make the claim that, you know what? A Mexican in the United States in relative prosperity and with zero personal understanding of what China actually looks like from the inside of China, what the specific relationships of employment, of labor, look like from the lens of a Chinese person with all of their history, all of their context going into it. I'm not going to make the claim that I know how to run their country better than they do. That's fucking ludicrous.
I'll make that claim all day. I could absolutely do it just by one reason. I wouldn't have 1 million people in concentration camps. I mean, by that metric alone, I would absolutely run a better government by them just off one thing. Because they are.
Well, I think it's worth noting that the Uyghurs, that we are saying that they're in concentration camps. Like, up until 2017, the United States classified them as terrorists. Like, it's the East Turkestan Islamic Party, and they were actively bombed by the United States military and combated by special forces, by regular armed forces, as terrorists, in the same way that ISIS or the Mujahideen were in the Soviet Union, in the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. It's kind of the same thing. If we're going to say, well, you can't do that, we can't do that to terrorists. We can't go in and bomb ISIS. We can't go in and militarily intervene in Libya if we're going to make that same claim for China. Because, you know, these same people that China is fighting, we were fighting too. We called them terrorists. And it was only in, I believe it was 2017, Donald Trump took them off the list of terrorist groups because, you know what? We can use that against China. China's getting pretty big in the britches. We need a way to take them down to scale. And you know what? Throughout history has been the best way to destroy another country? Get them involved in an anti-terrorist campaign. There's a reason that Afghanistan is known as the graveyard of empires, because everybody who went in there to try to occupy it, empire fell.
Yeah, I mean, this all happened because the U.S. very much directly, very openly funded, native fighters to fight off the Soviets in the 80s, and then they revolted against the U.S., formed Al-Qaeda, formed all these subgroups of terrorism. This is all American intervention. Everything we're seeing in the modern day modern world of terror is 1,025,000% directly because of America, in every possible conceivable outcome. We have done everything we're seeing is because of our own doing. So that doesn't justify the fact that men, women, and children are being tortured, starved, and worked to death in re-education concentration camps by over a scale of over 1 million. That doesn't justify.
Well, I think it's notable that the State Department themselves, everyone's like, oh, it's genocide. Well, one, like, the State Department themselves, in official press releases, has said, there's just no substantial evidence to support that claim that, one, it's genocide. Two,
I never said a lot genocide.
Of the... Oh, I know. I'm talking about the thing generally, the Uyghur issue, if you want to call it that, whatever you wish to call it. Two, like, a lot of these pictures, they're just regular ass Chinese prisons. Like, if you take a look at, like, one, what the signs are, because a lot of these pictures, they don't even bother to, like, crop out the signs or anything like that. It's like just a regular state prison facility. And if you identify it, like, look it up in the Chinese legal system, a lot of them aren't even in Xinjiang, or I'm sorry, I know I butchered that. I don't speak Chinese.
You said it better than I would have, brother. Let me tell you.
But we need to look at the specific examples of our evidence. Otherwise, well, I mean, if you don't examine your own evidence, you're so damn easy to lie to. If you just accept whatever comes across your feed because it's from a source that you trust, but you don't look into it, you're gonna get lied to. You're gonna get robbed. You're gonna get a bridge sold to you.
I mean, absolutely. That's a very common fact in U.S. media and U.S. news outlets historically. I mean, CIA, I don't know if you've heard Operation Mockingbird. The CIA back in the day, paid off ungodly amounts of news outlets to just propagandize current events that they just decided that they needed to propagandize. There's a big lineage of the U.S. and U.S. agencies directly funding, news outlets to shape the mind of Americans and whatnot. That's why I think there's a big disconnect with, even having this conversation. We haven't agreed on a vast amount of shit, but we've made, I feel like I've made more progress even having this conversation than 95% of Americans will ever have in their life, because they're so indoctrinated to thinking that anyone who thinks anything different than them is by nature an enemy in every way, no matter what. They're so indoctrinated that they won't even talk to the opposite person. You know what I mean? As an example, if we had this conversation with another person instead of myself, I guarantee you there's a large sect of the population who would have, as soon as we started this, when you said you were a former Nazi follower, they would have just hung up the conversation. And I'm not saying that hyperbole. I guarantee that would have happened, because people can't actually understand that people have different ideas that people don't think are good ones, because I don't think Nazism is good, I don't think Marxism is good, but I'm willing to fucking talk to people. A lot of people won't do that because of the indoctrination that goes on in this country and a lot of countries, to be honest, but mainly America, the U.S.
Well, with that, I think it's quite funny, just because I've crossed the entire political spectrum at one point or another. I've supported basically everything, just experimentally, yeah, let's get behind this. This looks like it's got some good ideas. I mean, if somebody's just going to dismiss, an entire idea based on the fact that I used to be a Nazi, I used to be confused, I used to be indoctrinated, I used to be in basically a fucking cult. You got to dismiss everything then at that point.
Well, I was Catholic, so I was in a cult, and I'm just fucking with you, but I know what you mean. So I had to throw a joke in there. It's been a very hard episode. I wanted to get a little lightheartedness in there a little bit if I could.
You're quite all right.
Fuck. Listen, guys. If you got, I think we can end it here. Just kind of end on civilized terms, understanding. If you guys are cool with that. And again, I'd love to do a longer format, or even just another hour and a half eventually down the road, if you guys would ever be open to it. Yeah, I appreciate you guys sitting down with me more than I can actually put into words. This was very educational for me, and please, anything you guys want to send me, I can even throw the links in the show notes of this video that people can check out, kind of things that you guys are referring to throughout the conversation or whatnot, or anything you think that people might find interesting, I could throw in the show notes for sure.
Oh, absolutely. I think to understand the Marxist-Leninist position, you have to understand dialectical materialism from a fairly technical perspective. And so I think one of the things that, if you want to understand it, the best resource you can do is Joseph Stalin's Historical and Dialectical Materialism. Or, excuse me, Dialectical and Historical Materialism. My apologies.
I'll make sure that whatever I send your way, there's a lot of free resources on the internet, most prominently a website called Marxist.org. So all the books should be free and easy to access.
Awesome. Appreciate it. Any final things you guys want to toss in before we wrap it up here? Any final words or whatnot?
I'm totally good. Thank you for having us on.
That's my pleasure, man.
It was my pleasure indeed.
Awesome. All right. Well, thank you everybody for watching. I appreciate it. Hope you all found this kind of enjoyable. Hope you enjoy this. The mainly civilized. I got a little out of control a time or two, and that's totally my fault. But I hope you enjoyed the vast majority of the civilization the civilized that we try to portray here. One love, everybody. Appreciate you. Thank you.